whispers in the dark. Make sure the lights are low, the door is locked, and whatever is sitting in the darkest corner of your room is exactly where you left it. This story is inspired by the legend of Annabelle, the doll that should never have been touched, never have been moved, and never have been welcomed into a home. Some objects are not haunted because something died near them. Some are haunted because something was waiting inside them long before death ever had a name. Now let's begin. The house stood at the end of Crooked Elm Lane, where the road thinned into cracked asphalt and old trees leaned over the pavement like crooked witnesses. It was a tall, narrow house with gray clapboard siding, black shutters, and windows that reflected the sky even at night. People in town used to say it had good bones. That was what realtors said when they meant the walls had not fallen in yet, when the floors still held, when the roof only groaned during storms instead of giving way. To the Bellamy family, it looked like a beginning. Daniel Bellamy had spent 2 years searching for a place his family could afford after the hospital bills, the layoffs, and the move from the city that had left his wife hollow-eyed and quiet. He was 39, broad-shouldered, tired in the way men get when they pretend fear is only a matter of arithmetic. His hair had begun to gray at the temples, and his hands were always rough from fixing things he could not afford to replace. He had once been the kind of father who carried both children at once and made monsters out of blankets. By the time they reached Crooked Elm Lane, he smiled only when someone was looking. His wife, Miriam, sat beside him in the passenger seat, staring through the windshield at the house with an expression that did not belong to hope. She was 36, thin and graceful, with dark hair she kept tied at the base of her neck. Her eyes were a pale green that seemed almost colorless in certain light. She had been a music teacher before the panic attacks, before the miscarriage, before silence began to gather around her like dust. She still hummed when she cooked, but never full songs, only broken pieces, phrases that stopped before they became recognizable. In the back seat, 12-year-old Sophie pressed her face to the window. She was sharp, watchful, too clever for adults to lie to easily. She wore her black hair in 2 uneven braids and carried a sketchbook everywhere. She liked drawing birds with human teeth and girls with empty eye sockets, then insisting they were not scary. Her little brother Caleb, 7 years old and moon-faced, held a plastic dinosaur in one hand and a packet of crackers in the other. He believed in ghosts, but only nice ones. He thought every strange sound was a visitor. Their van rolled up the gravel drive just as the last light drained behind the trees. The house seemed to lean forward. Daniel put it in park and forced brightness into his voice. "Well," he said, "home sweet home." No one answered. A wind moved through the yard. Dead leaves dragged themselves across the porch. Somewhere inside the house, something knocked once. Miriam turned her head sharply. "Did you hear that?" "Pipes," Daniel said too quickly. "Old houses make sounds." Sophie looked at the upstairs window on the left. The glass was dark, but she had the unsettling feeling that darkness was not the absence of light. It was the presence of something standing behind the pane. Caleb whispered, "Someone is in there." Daniel unbuckled his seat belt. "No one is in there. We have the keys." The move began in the sour gray light of evening. Boxes scraped across the porch. Furniture thudded against walls. The house smelled of dry wood, old plaster, and something beneath it, faint but persistent, like flowers left too long in dirty water. The rooms were large and cold. The ceilings were high. Every footstep rang longer than it should have. The previous owner had died 6 months earlier. That was all the realtor had said. An elderly woman, no family, natural causes. Daniel had accepted this the way desperate people accept small omissions. He did not ask where she died. He did not ask why the house had sat empty. He did not ask why the price had dropped twice in 1 month. That first night, after pizza eaten from paper plates and mattresses dragged into bedrooms, Caleb found the locked room. It was at the end of the upstairs hall, past Sophie's room, where the wallpaper changed from faded blue flowers to something older and uglier. A brown pattern of curling vines that looked like veins. The door was narrow, painted white, with a brass knob so tarnished it appeared almost black. A small keyhole sat beneath it. Caleb stood before it in his dinosaur pajamas. Inside, someone giggled. It was very soft. A little girl's giggle, muffled by wood. Caleb leaned closer. "Hello." The giggle stopped. The door gave one slow creak, although it did not open. Caleb ran to his parents' room and shook Miriam awake. Daniel found him trembling, insisting there was a girl in the little room at the end of the hall. Daniel went with a flashlight and a crowbar, muttering about raccoons in the walls. Miriam followed, arms wrapped around herself. Sophie stood in her doorway, watching. The door was locked. Daniel wedged the crowbar near the latch. The wood cracked with a dry, splitting sound, and the door swung inward on a breath of air so cold that Miriam gasped. The room was not a bedroom. It was a storage closet, but larger than it looked from the hall. Dust filmed the shelves. Old jars lined one wall, filled with buttons, pins, yellowed lace, and black thread. There were hat boxes stacked in a corner. A cracked mirror stood against the far wall, its surface clouded by age. In the center of the floor was a child-sized rocking chair. On the chair sat a doll. She was almost 3 feet tall, made to look like a little girl, though not convincingly. Her face was porcelain, pale and glossy, with painted lashes and bright blue eyes that seemed too wet. Her mouth was curved into a tiny red smile. Dark curls framed her face beneath a white bonnet. She wore a faded cream dress with lace at the collar, and on her lap rested 2 small hands with jointed fingers. Around her neck hung a tag tied with brown string. Sophie stepped closer before anyone could stop her. She wiped dust from the card with her thumb and read the name in a quiet voice. "Annabelle." The room seemed to listen. Miriam said, "Don't touch it." But Caleb was already smiling. His fear had melted into wonder. "She's pretty." "No," Sophie said. Daniel laughed once, a brittle sound. "She is a creepy old doll, that is all, probably valuable." Miriam stared at the doll. The painted smile was small, polite, patient. "Put it back," she whispered. "It is already here," Daniel said. "We can box it up tomorrow." But tomorrow did not come the way it should. That night, Sophie dreamed of thread. Black thread winding around her wrists, her ankles, her tongue. She dreamed she was lying beneath the floorboards while someone walked above her, humming one of her mother's broken songs. When she opened her mouth to scream, wooden fingers pushed between her lips and pulled out a long, wet ribbon of black thread that had grown from inside her throat. She woke before dawn, choking. At the foot of her bed stood Annabelle. The doll sat upright on Sophie's old toy chest, hands folded, head tilted slightly toward her. Sophie stared at it in the blue darkness. Her bedroom door was closed. The doll's lace dress hung over the edge of the chest like a shroud. Sophie could not move. Her body felt pinned beneath an invisible weight. Her eyes watered. Her lungs struggled. The doll smiled. Somewhere inside the walls, a child giggled. Then Sophie blinked, and Annabelle was gone. In the morning, Daniel found the doll back in the storage room. He accused Sophie of trying to scare Caleb. Sophie denied it with such cold seriousness that he became angry. Not because he thought she was lying, but because he hated the small tremor that passed through him when she said, "Dad, she was in my room." Miriam said nothing. She stood at the stove making eggs no one ate, and every few seconds she looked toward the staircase. The first death came on the third day. It was small, at least in the way adults measure death when they are desperate to keep functioning. Caleb's hamster Pickle had survived the move in a plastic cage beside his bed. Caleb loved the creature with a devotion so complete that he whispered secrets into its bedding every night. On the third morning, Caleb came downstairs carrying the cage in both hands. He was not crying. That was what made Miriam drop the mug she was holding. Pickle was inside the cage, but not in any shape that belonged to a living thing. The tiny body had been carefully opened from throat to belly, its fur parted neatly like fabric. Its ribs were spread like the petals of a flower. Its organs had been arranged in a circle around it, precise and glistening, as if someone with very small fingers had made a ritual from the body. In the bedding, written in tiny dark smears, were the words, "She likes me best." Caleb looked up at them with blank eyes. "Annabelle did it," he said. Daniel slapped the cage out of his hands. It hit the floor and cracked. Miriam screamed. Sophie ran from the room. Daniel buried the hamster beneath the maple tree and told Caleb sometimes animals hurt themselves when frightened. It was a cruel lie and a stupid one, and even Caleb did not believe it. That afternoon, Daniel put Annabelle in a cardboard box, taped it shut, drove 3 miles to the dump, and threw it into a rusted metal container full of broken furniture and black bags. He stood there in the stink of rot and gasoline, breathing hard, feeling ridiculous and relieved. When he returned home, the box was on the porch. It was unopened. Miriam saw it first from the kitchen window. She made a sound like a person being strangled. Daniel went pale. He carried the box to the garage, poured lighter fluid over it, and set it on fire in a metal trash barrel. The flames burned blue at the edges. The cardboard blackened. The tape curled. Smoke coiled up toward the rafters. From inside the burning box came a child's laughter. Not pain, not fear. Delight. Daniel backed away. The fire went out by itself. When the smoke cleared, Annabelle sat inside the barrel, untouched. Her cream dress was clean. Her bonnet was straight. Her blue eyes shone in the dim garage light. Her painted smile looked wider. That evening, Miriam called the church. Father Callow arrived just before sunset. A thin old priest with liver-spotted hands, and a voice that had comforted hundreds of grieving people. He smelled faintly of mint and rain. He listened without interrupting while Miriam spoke. Daniel paced behind her, jaw tight, refusing to sit. Sophie held Caleb on the couch. Caleb stared at the hallway as if something might crawl from it at any moment. Father Callow asked to see the doll. They had placed Annabelle in the storage room again because no one wanted her anywhere else, and no one could remove her. The priest stood in the doorway a long time before entering. His expression changed only slightly, but Sophie saw it. She saw the way his mouth tightened. She saw the way he held his breath. He sprinkled holy water. The droplets touched the doll's porcelain face and sizzled. Miriam began to cry. Father Callow whispered prayers in Latin, his voice growing stronger. The house groaned around them. Dust fell from the ceiling. The jars on the shelves rattled. In the cracked mirror, Sophie saw something that was not reflected in the room. A woman stood behind the priest. She was tall and gray-skinned, wearing a dress the color of old burial cloth. Her hair hung in wet ropes over her face. Her hands were too long, fingers reaching nearly to her knees. She leaned forward until her hidden face was beside Father Callow's ear. Sophie screamed. The priest turned. There was nothing behind him. Then Annabelle moved. Only her eyes, the painted blue pupils, slid toward Father Callow. The old man stopped praying. His lips trembled. His rosary fell from his fingers. His face emptied of color so completely he seemed to age 20 years in a second. "What is it?" Daniel demanded. Father Callow stepped backward. "We cannot cast out what was invited before you came," he said. "We did not invite anything," Miriam sobbed. The priest looked at her with terrible pity. "Someone did." He left the house shaking. At the front door, he paused and turned back. Do not speak to it. Do not promise it anything. Do not let the children be alone." Then he walked into the night. 2 days later, Father Callow was found in the bell tower of St. Agnes. He had climbed the narrow stairs sometime before morning and tied the bell rope around his neck, but he had not hung himself. The coroner said that was impossible. The bell rope had been wound around his throat from below, pulled upward with such force that the vertebrae had separated. His feet were still on the ground. His hands were clasped in prayer. His tongue had been pulled down to his chest. Inside his mouth, someone had placed a tiny porcelain finger. After the priest died, the Bellamy house changed. Not all at once. Evil rarely wastes itself in grand gestures when it can rot a life from the corners inward. At first it was the sounds, footsteps in empty rooms, a ball rolling across the upstairs hall, though neither child owned one, a lullaby humming from inside the vents, the wet slap of bare feet in the basement at 3 in the morning, scratching behind walls that stopped when Daniel pressed his ear against them, then began again behind his head. Then came the smells: rotten milk in Sophie's room, smoke in the hallway, the sharp copper stink of blood in the bathroom where the tiles remained spotless. Miriam woke one night to the scent of roses so strong it gagged her. When she opened her eyes, Annabelle was lying beside her on Daniel's side of the bed, tucked under the blanket, smiling at her. Miriam screamed until her throat bled. Daniel grabbed the doll and hurled it down the stairs. It landed at the bottom with a hollow crack. For a moment, silence. Then the doll began to giggle. Not a recorded sound, not a squeak from a toy. A living laugh, high and breathy, bubbling up the stairwell. Daniel ran down and stomped on her porcelain face again and again. The impact sent cracks through the floorboards. Miriam begged him to stop. Caleb sobbed. Sophie watched from the landing, unable to look away. When Daniel finally stepped back, Annabelle's face was unmarked, but Daniel's foot was bleeding through his sock. Later, Miriam peeled the sock away and found 3 deep punctures in the sole, as if small teeth had bitten into him. By morning, the wounds had darkened at the edges. By evening, black veins climbed his ankle. He told no one. The next person to come was Alina Price, the realtor. Daniel called her in a fury, demanding the full history of the house. At first, she denied knowing anything. By the end of the call, he was screaming so loudly that Miriam took the children outside. Alina arrived that afternoon in a navy coat and expensive perfume, clutching a folder to her chest like a shield. She was a polished woman with silver blonde hair and a smile trained by years of selling bad foundations to good families. But the smile slipped the moment she crossed the threshold. "I did not know it was this bad," she whispered. Daniel closed the door behind her. "What does that mean?" Alina looked toward the stairs. Mrs. Whitcomb kept the room locked. The room with the doll. Alina flinched. She told people it belonged to her daughter. She had a daughter Miriam asked. Alina opened the folder with trembling fingers. Inside were old property records, a newspaper clipping, and a photograph yellowed with age. The photograph showed the storage room when it had been a nursery. A crib stood against the wall. A rocking chair sat near the window. In the chair was a little girl, perhaps 5 years old, holding Annabelle in her lap. The child had dark curls, a white dress, and eyes that looked too solemn for her face. On the back of the photograph, in faded ink, someone had written, "Rose and her special friend." Alina swallowed. Rose Whitcomb died in this house in 1968. Her mother said she fell down the stairs, but the undertaker reported injuries that did not match a fall. Her jaw was broken. Her fingers were crushed. There were bite marks on her arms. Miriam put a hand over her mouth. Daniel stared at the photograph and the doll. Mrs. Whitcomb refused to part with it. She said Rose lived in it. Sophie spoke from the doorway. She does not. Everyone turned. Sophie's face was pale, but her voice was steady. The little girl is scared of it too. The house went silent. A floorboard creaked above them. Alina began backing toward the door. I should not have come. Daniel caught her arm. You are not leaving until you tell us how to get rid of it. Alina's eyes filled with tears. I do not know. Something thumped upstairs. Once, twice, then a slow dragging sound moved across the ceiling above the living room. Alina whispered, "What is that?" The ceiling split. A dark stain bloomed across the plaster. Red droplets fell onto the coffee table. Miriam pulled Caleb back. Daniel looked up as the stain widened, dripping faster, pattering onto the rug. Sophie screamed, "Move." The ceiling burst open. A deer carcass crashed into the living room, wet and mangled, though no one knew how it had gotten into the house. Its rib cage had been pried apart. Its head twisted halfway around. Its eyes were missing. Something had carved letters into the pale flesh of its belly. She is home. Alina made a high animal sound and ran. They found her car still idling in the driveway. Driver door open, purse on the seat. Alina herself was found 3 weeks later in her own attic, though police reports said she had never returned home after leaving Crooked Elm Lane. Her body had been folded into a steamer trunk that was half her size. Every bone had been broken to make her fit. Her mouth had been sewn into a smile with black thread. In her hands, she clutched the yellowed photograph of Rose Whitcomb holding Annabelle. After Alina disappeared, Daniel stopped sleeping. He sat in the kitchen every night with a hammer, a flashlight, and a bottle of whiskey. The black veins had reached his calf. His eyes sank deep into his face. He muttered to himself, sometimes prayers, sometimes curses, sometimes apologies to people who were not there. Miriam moved the children into the same room and slept on the floor between their beds. She pushed a dresser against the door each night. She put salt at the windows because she had read somewhere that salt could keep evil out. In the morning, the salt was always arranged into tiny smiling faces. Caleb changed most of all. He spoke less. He stopped playing. He began drawing the same picture over and over in crayon. A house, a doll, a tall dark shape behind it, 4 stick figures lying on the ground, one small figure standing beside the doll, holding its hand. When Miriam asked who the standing figure was, Caleb said, "That is me after she takes my skin off." Miriam slapped him before she knew she had moved. The sound cracked through the room. Caleb looked up at her, not hurt, not surprised, only tired. From the hallway, Annabelle laughed. Miriam broke. She ran into the storage room and attacked the doll with scissors. She stabbed at the soft body beneath the dress. She cut the lace, ripped the bonnet, dug the blades into the porcelain throat. She screamed until words became only sound. Daniel pulled her away, but not before one of the doll's eyes popped loose and rolled under the chair. For one breath, everyone froze. Annabelle sat with one blue eye and one dark, empty socket. Then something inside the socket blinked. A small, wet eye opened in the black hollow, not painted, not glass, but alive. It swiveled toward Miriam. A voice came from the doll. It was not a child's voice. It was many voices pressed into one, whispering from far away and from directly inside their ears. "Mother," Miriam fainted. That night the power went out. Rain beat against the windows, though the forecast had been clear. The house shuddered beneath wind that bent the trees toward the roof. Daniel tried to start the generator in the garage, but the pull cord snapped and whipped across his hand, splitting the skin to the bone. He came back inside bleeding, wrapped in a towel. The family gathered in the living room with candles on the mantel. Their shadows climbed the walls, long and warped. Caleb slept against Miriam's lap. Sophie sat beside him, holding a kitchen knife. Daniel stood near the door, swaying slightly. At midnight, the telephone rang. The sound made them all jump. The landline had not worked since they moved in. It rang again. Daniel lifted the receiver. At first, only static. Then a girl's voice whispered, "Daddy." Daniel closed his eyes. Miriam stared at him. "Hang up." The voice came again, sweeter, closer. "Daddy, why did you let her hurt me?" Daniel's face twisted. Sophie had never heard her father make the sound that came from him then. It was grief, but not the grief she knew. It was old, buried, poisoned by guilt. Miriam stood slowly. "Who is that?" Daniel shook his head. Tears ran down his face. Before Sophie was born, before Miriam, there had been another life. Another woman. Another child. A little girl named Lily, dead at 4 years old after a drunk driver crossed the center line. Daniel had survived the crash. His daughter had not. He never spoke of her. He had locked her name away like a room at the end of a hall. The voice on the phone sobbed, "Daddy, I was so cold." Daniel gripped the receiver. until his knuckles went white. Miriam whispered, "It is not her." The voice changed. It became wet and broken, speaking around shattered teeth. "You left me in the car." Daniel screamed and slammed the phone down. Every candle went out. In the dark, something crawled across the ceiling. They heard nails clicking against plaster. Sophie grabbed Caleb. Miriam shouted Daniel's name. The thing above them moved fast, circling, whispering in Lily's voice, Rose's voice, Father Callow's voice, Alina's voice. It said their names. It told secrets. It laughed with mouths it had stolen. Lightning flashed. For a fraction of a second, Sophie saw Annabelle upside down on the ceiling, clinging there like an insect. Her head turned all the way around. Her smile stretched across her face, splitting the porcelain at the corners. Then darkness. Something dropped onto Daniel. He screamed as small hands gripped his face. Miriam found the flashlight and turned it on. Daniel was on the floor, thrashing, with Annabelle attached to his head. Her tiny fingers were buried in his cheeks. Her mouth was pressed to his left eye. There was a sucking sound. Daniel clawed at her. Miriam grabbed the doll's body and pulled. Sophie stabbed with the kitchen knife. Caleb screamed into a cushion. The doll came away with a wet pop. Daniel's eye was gone. The socket poured blood down his face. He howled, hands pressed to the ruin. Annabelle landed on the rug, sitting upright. Something glistened red between her painted lips. She swallowed. Miriam dragged Daniel to the car with Sophie's help. They were leaving. House, boxes, debt. Everything could rot. Caleb stumbled after them, barefoot in the rain. The family piled into the van, Daniel moaning in the passenger seat with towels pressed to his face. Miriam turned the key. The engine started. For one impossible second, hope returned. Then the headlights came on, and Annabelle was standing at the end of the driveway. Not sitting, standing. Her little shoes were planted in the mud. Rain slid down her porcelain cheeks. Miriam hit the gas. The van shot forward. The doll vanished beneath the bumper. Miriam kept driving. They reached the end of Crooked Elm Lane, turned onto the county road, and sped toward town. Daniel sobbed. Caleb prayed. Sophie looked out the back window until the house disappeared behind the trees. Then Caleb said, "Mom." Miriam did not answer. "Mom, what?" "She is in the car." Miriam looked in the rear view mirror. Annabelle sat between Sophie and Caleb, soaked from the rain, hands folded in her lap. Her red smile gleamed in the dark. Miriam screamed and lost control. The van swerved across the road, struck a tree, and folded around it with a sound like a giant crushing a tin can. Glass burst inward. Metal screamed. The airbags exploded. For a moment, there was only steam, rain, and the steady ticking of the engine. Sophie woke hanging from her seat belt, blood running into her hair. Caleb was crying beside her. Miriam slumped over the steering wheel, Daniel was unconscious, his face a red mask. Annabelle was gone. A truck driver found them 20 minutes later and called emergency services. By dawn, the Bellamys were in the county hospital. The doctor said they were lucky. Miriam had a concussion and 2 broken ribs. Daniel had lost an eye and a great deal of blood, but he would live. Sophie needed stitches. Caleb had only bruises. For the first time in weeks, there was no doll. The relief lasted until the nurse came in with a cardboard box of belongings recovered from the crash. Inside, wrapped in Sophie's bloody jacket, was Annabelle. The nurse did not see anything strange. She smiled kindly and said, "Looks like someone's special toy made it through." Miriam began screaming so violently that hospital security had to restrain her. After that, people stopped believing the Bellamys. Fear can be convincing when it is quiet, but terror makes people look insane. Daniel ranted about the doll to doctors, police officers, and a hospital chaplain. Miriam refused sedation until she collapsed. Sophie spoke only when asked direct questions. Caleb told a child psychologist that Annabelle liked hospitals because there were lots of people already close to dying. By the second night, 2 nurses had requested transfer from their floor. One said she saw a little girl with a broken neck standing in the supply closet. Another found handprints inside a sealed medication cabinet. Tiny, bloody handprints climbing the glass from the inside. On the 3rd night, the hospital chaplain entered Daniel's room to pray with him. He was a kind man named Reverend Shaw, younger than Father Callow, with gentle eyes and a careful voice. He listened to Daniel's story without judgment. He agreed to remove the doll from the hospital and take it to a secure place until someone could decide what to do. Sophie watched him pick Annabelle up. The moment his hands touched the doll, every monitor in the room flatlined. Patients screamed up and down the ward. Lights flickered. Somewhere, an infant began wailing. Reverend Shaw froze, arms stiff, Annabelle held against his chest. The doll's head turned toward him. He dropped her. His hands were burned black from palm to fingertip. The monitors resumed. Reverend Shaw left the room without another word. He walked out of the hospital, drove home, and did not speak for 3 days. On the 4th, his wife found him sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. He had used a carving knife to remove the skin from his palms. On the table, written in strips of his own flesh, was a single sentence. "I held her and she held me back." He survived, though he never returned to the church. He spent the rest of his life in a private facility, refusing to sleep unless both his hands were tied to the bed rails. Every night at 3:17, he woke and begged someone to take the little girl off the ceiling. The Bellamys were discharged 1 week later. They did not return to the house willingly. They had nowhere else to go, and every relative Daniel called either refused or stopped answering after the first conversation. Insurance would not pay until the investigation of the crash ended. The bank did not care about ghosts. The hospital bills grew. The world continued, indifferent and hungry. So they returned to Crooked Elm Lane. The house looked unchanged. The front door stood open, though Daniel was certain he had locked it. Inside, the air was warm and damp. Flies gathered on the windows in thick black clusters. The deer carcass had been removed before the crash, yet the stain on the living room rug had spread. It now covered nearly the entire floor, dark and sticky, poolsing faintly like meat. Annabelle sat in the rocking chair in the storage room. Her dress was no longer torn. Her missing eye had returned. Around her neck, the tag with her name had been replaced by a strip of paper torn from a hospital chart. On it, written in red crayon, were 4 words. "You came back home." Daniel shut the door. No one spoke during dinner. That night, Miriam made a decision. She waited until Daniel passed out in the kitchen, drunk and feverish, his blackened leg propped on a chair. She waited until Caleb slept, curled around his dinosaur. She waited until Sophie finally closed her eyes. Then she went to the storage room with a pillowcase. Annabelle was in the chair. Miriam stood over her for a long time. "I am her mother," she whispered. "Not you." The doll smiled. Miriam grabbed her, shoved her into the pillowcase, tied it with electrical cord, and carried it down to the basement. The basement door had always stuck. Tonight it opened easily. The air below was wet and cold. The concrete floor glistened. Shelves lined the walls, filled with paint cans, old tools, and jars of screws. In the far corner was a coal chute sealed with bricks. Miriam had found the old well the day before. It was beneath a square of rotting plywood near the furnace. She did not know why a house had been built over it. She did not care. The well was narrow, lined with stone, descending into blackness that smelled of mud and old water. She dragged the pillowcase to the edge. Inside, the doll began to move. Not violently, gently, like a child waking. Miriam kicked the bundle into the well. It fell without a sound. She stood there shaking, listening. Nothing. Then from far below, a splash. Miriam laughed. It came out broken, but it was laughter. She climbed the stairs and locked the basement door. In the morning, Caleb was gone. His bed was empty. His dinosaur lay on the pillow. The window was shut. The door was blocked by the dresser from inside. Sophie woke to Miriam screaming his name. They searched the house. They searched the yard. Daniel limped through the woods with a flashlight, though the sun was up. Police came. Neighbors came. Dogs came. The dogs refused to enter the house. One broke its leash and ran until its handler found it later, belly split open on a barbed wire fence, though the fence was half a mile away. At noon, Sophie heard Caleb laughing. It came from the basement. She found Miriam at the top of the stairs, frozen, one hand on the doorknob. Daniel came behind them, face gray. "Caleb," Miriam called. From below, Caleb answered. She was lonely. Daniel opened the door. The basement light did not work. They descended with flashlights. The air grew colder with each step. Water trickled somewhere in the dark. At the bottom, the plywood covering the well had been pushed aside. Caleb stood beside it. He was barefoot, smiling, soaked from head to toe in black water. His skin had a bluish cast. Mud clung to his pajamas. His eyes looked wrong, too bright, reflecting their flashlights like an animal. In his arms, he held Annabelle. Miriam made a choking sound. Caleb stroked the doll's hair. She said you tried to drown her. Daniel stepped forward. Put it down, buddy. Caleb shook his head. She says I can be her brother. Sophie whispered, Caleb, please. He looked at her then, and for 1 second, his face crumpled. The real Caleb surfaced beneath whatever had wrapped itself around him. Tears filled his eyes. Sophie, he said, it is so cold down there. Then Annabelle's head turned toward him, and Caleb's expression went blank. The well behind him began to breathe. A long inhalation rose from the black hole, drawing dust, cobwebs, and loose papers across the floor. The flashlights flickered. Miriam screamed and lunged for Caleb. Daniel grabbed her too late. Caleb stepped backward. He fell into the well. Miriam caught his wrist. For 1 terrible second, mother and son hung between worlds. Caleb dangled over the darkness, his wet fingers slipping from Miriam's grip. Daniel grabbed her waist. Sophie grabbed Caleb's other hand. Annabelle was still in Caleb's arms. The doll looked up at Miriam. Her mouth opened. Inside was not porcelain, not stuffing, not the hollow of a toy. It was a deep red throat lined with tiny human teeth. She bit into Miriam's wrist. Miriam screamed, but did not let go. The bite tore through skin and tendon. Blood poured down Caleb's arm. Miriam held on, sobbing, muscles shaking. Pull, Daniel roared. They pulled. For a moment, they were winning. Then something in the well pulled back. Hands rose from the darkness. Not one pair. Many. Pale hands, gray hands, child hands. Hands with broken fingers, hands missing nails. Hands slick with mud and blood. They gripped Caleb's legs. They climbed his pajamas. They wrapped around his waist. Caleb screamed. It was the last human sound he ever made. The hands yanked. Miriam's wrist split open to the bone. Caleb vanished into the well. His scream dropped away into impossible distance. Then silence. Daniel fell backward, dragging Miriam with him. Sophie crawled to the edge, sobbing Caleb's name into the black. Something floated up from below. Caleb's dinosaur. It bobbed in the darkness, though there was no water near the top. Then Annabelle's voice whispered from the well. Mind. Miriam never recovered. They found Caleb's body 3 days later when police drained the well. Or rather, they found enough to identify him. He had been folded into the stone wall behind loose bricks, though the space was too narrow for a child's body. His limbs had been twisted behind him. His ribs were cracked outward. His mouth was stuffed with black thread. His eyes were open. In his hands, he held a small card. Written on it in careful red letters were the words, "Thank you for the brother." The official report called it an accidental fall with animal damage and post-mortem distortion. No one could explain why several officers who entered the basement later reported hearing children whispering under the floor. One officer, a young man named Paul Mercer, resigned the next day. A week later, he drove his patrol car into a lake, though he had not been on duty. His body was recovered in the driver's seat, hands cuffed behind his back with his own handcuffs. The windows were up. The doors were locked. In the fogged glass of the windshield, someone had traced a smiling face from the inside. After Caleb's funeral, the Bellamy family became 3 shadows haunting a house that had already eaten them. Miriam stopped speaking. She sat in Caleb's room for hours, holding his dinosaur, rocking back and forth. Sometimes Sophie heard her whispering, "Give him back," though no one answered. Other times, she heard a child whispering back, "Daniel drank until he vomited blood." The black veins from the bite wounds had spread up his thigh and across his belly. Doctors could not identify the infection. He refused to return to the hospital. He said hospitals had too many doors. Sophie became the only one still fighting. She searched the storage room whenever Annabelle was not there. She read every paper Alina had left behind. She found old diaries hidden inside the cracked mirror, pages written by Margaret Whitcomb, Rose's mother. The handwriting began neat and elegant, then became frantic over the years, slanting across pages, words jammed into margins. At first, Margaret wrote of Rose's imaginary friend, a girl in the walls, a lady in the mirror, a doll that moved closer to the bed each night. Then Rose began waking with bruises shaped like fingers. Margaret blamed servants, neighbors, herself. The doll appeared in places it could not be. Rose cried when it was near. Rose begged her mother to burn it. The final entries were almost illegible. It is not Rose. It wears what it takes. It learns love so it can imitate it. It wants a family because families open doors. The doll is only the handle. The thing behind it is still outside, pushing. Sophie read until her hands shook. The last page contained instructions. Not a ritual, not an exorcism, a warning. Do not destroy the doll. Do not bury the doll. Do not give the doll away. It follows attachment, not possession. To starve it, deny it witness. No fear, no grief, no bargain. Lock it where no living eye can see it, and never speak its name. Below that, Margaret had written one last sentence before the ink trailed off. Rose looked at it one last time, and it looked back through her. Sophie understood then why no one could help. Everyone who came saw it. Everyone who saw it became part of its story. Fear fed it, Attention shaped it. Grief gave it voices. Love gave it masks. And their family had fed it a feast. That night, Sophie told Daniel. He sat at the kitchen table, sweating, one eye staring, and the empty socket hidden beneath a bandage. His skin had yellowed. The smell coming from his leg was sweet and rotten. "We have to lock it away," Sophie said. "No one can look at it again." Daniel laughed softly. "You think a lock will stop it?" "No, but maybe not being seen will." He stared at her for a long time. "Where is it now?" Sophie did not answer. From upstairs came the creak of the rocking chair. Back and forth. Daniel stood, swaying. "I am going to end this." "Dad, no." But he was already taking the axe from beside the basement door. Sophie followed him up the stairs, begging. Miriam emerged from Caleb's room, silent and pale, clutching the dinosaur. The storage room door was open. Annabelle sat in the rocking chair. Daniel stepped inside. The room seemed deeper than before. The shelves stretched into shadow. The cracked mirror reflected not the room, but a field under a black sky. In that field stood dozens of people. Father Callow, Alina Price, Reverend Shaw with bandaged hands, Officer Mercer dripping lake water, Caleb, blue-lipped and smiling sadly. Others Sophie did not recognize. Men, women, children, all staring toward the glass. Daniel raised the axe. Annabelle looked up at him with her bright blue eyes. Then she spoke in Lily's voice. "Daddy, I forgive you." Daniel froze. Sophie shouted, "It is lying." The doll lifted one small hand toward him. Daniel dropped the axe. He fell to his knees in front of Annabelle, sobbing. "I am sorry. I am so sorry." The doll's porcelain fingers touched his cheek. His face softened. Then Annabelle pushed her thumb into his remaining eye. Daniel's scream tore through the house. The doll climbed him as he thrashed, small hands sinking into his skin with impossible strength. His body slammed against the shelves. Jars shattered. Buttons scattered like teeth. Miriam stood in the doorway, unable to move. Sophie grabbed the axe. Daniel fell onto his back. Annabelle sat on his chest, her face close to his. The thing behind her filled the room now, unfolding from the walls. Sophie could not see it fully. Her mind refused. She saw long gray limbs, a mouth opening where a stomach should be, hair floating as if underwater, a crown of tiny hands, eyes inside the darkness, hundreds of them, all wet and eager. Daniel's screams became wet choking. Annabelle's little jaw opened wider and wider. Porcelain cracked from ear to ear. She lowered her mouth over Daniel's face. Sophie swung the axe. The blade struck Annabelle's shoulder and passed through cloth, stuffing, and something that bled black. The doll jerked backward. Daniel rolled, face ruined, gasping. The house screamed. Every window shattered. The walls bowed inward. Miriam woke from her paralysis and threw herself at the doll. She grabbed Annabelle with both hands and held her against her chest like an infant. "Take me," Miriam whispered. "Give Caleb back." Sophie screamed, "No." Annabelle turned her head toward Miriam. The smile returned. Miriam's body arched. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her skin tightened across her bones. Her cheeks hollowed. Her hair whitened at the roots. Sophie heard something being pulled from her mother, not flesh, not blood, but the hidden self beneath them. Miriam's eyes dimmed as if lamps were being lowered inside her skull. For 1 second, Caleb's voice came from the doll. "Mommy." Miriam smiled through tears. "Baby." Then her body split. It began at the mouth. The corners tore wider, up toward the ears, not in a clean cut, but in a ragged red opening. Her jaw unhinged. Her throat bulged. Something inside her pushed outward. Fingers appeared between her teeth, small and pale. Sophie watched in frozen horror as Annabelle crawled from Miriam's mouth, slick with blood and saliva, reborn from her grief. Miriam collapsed, empty-eyed. Her face stretched into an obscene grin. Daniel, blind and dying, crawled toward Sophie's voice. "Run," he gurgled. Sophie ran. She ran not outside, but to the attic. She had found the old trunk there 2 days earlier. It was iron-bound, heavy, lined with lead, once used for storing photographic plates. It had a latch that could be sealed from the outside. If Margaret was right, the doll did not need to be destroyed. It needed to be unseen. Sophie dragged the trunk to the center of the attic floor. Rain poured through broken roof slates. The house shook. Below, Daniel screamed once and stopped. Small footsteps climbed the attic stairs. Sophie opened the trunk. She stood behind the door, gripping the axe. Annabelle appeared at the top of the stairs. Her dress was soaked red. Her bonnet hung crooked. Her porcelain face was cracked now, but beneath each crack Sophie saw movement, soft and wet. The doll tilted her head. "Sophie," she said in Caleb's voice. Sophie clenched her teeth. "Do not look," she whispered to herself. But she had to. She had one chance. Annabelle stepped into the attic. The boards creaked beneath her tiny shoes. "Sophie, it hurts in the dark." The voice was Caleb's, perfect, trembling, afraid. Tears blurred Sophie's vision. Annabelle came closer. "Please do not lock me away." Sophie raised the axe. The doll's eyes changed. They became Miriam's green eyes, full of sorrow. "Sweetheart," the doll whispered, "I only wanted us to be together." Sophie screamed and swung the axe into the floor beside her, not at Annabelle. The blade shattered the rotten board. The attic tilted. Annabelle stumbled. Sophie lunged, wrapped her arms around the doll, and threw herself backward into the open trunk. For a moment, she held Annabelle against her chest. The doll was not cold, it was warm. It had a heartbeat. Tiny fingers crawled up Sophie's neck. The doll whispered into her ear, with all the stolen voices at once. "I will show you where they are." Sophie almost answered. Almost. Instead, she slammed the lid down from inside with both feet as she rolled out. The trunk lid caught Annabelle's arm. The doll shrieked. Sophie kicked again. The arm snapped with a wet crack. The lid closed. The attic went silent. Sophie scrambled up and fastened the latch. Then she dragged the old mirror over the trunk, face down. She piled blankets, boxes, and boards on top. She never once looked at the crack beneath the lid. From inside the trunk came a soft knock. Then Caleb's voice. "Sophie." She pressed her hands over her ears. Another knock. Miriam's voice. "Please." Another knock. Daniel's voice. "I cannot see." Sophie screamed until her throat tore, but she did not open it. By morning, the house was quiet. Police found Sophie sitting on the porch in the rain, covered in blood that was not all hers. Inside, they found Daniel dead in the upstairs hall, both eyes gone, his face peeled from forehead to chin. They found Miriam in the storage room, folded in the rocking chair, mouth stretched into a smile, so wide the jaw had split. They found no trace of the doll. They found the iron trunk in the attic. When an officer asked what was inside, Sophie said, "Do not open it." Of course they opened it. The trunk was empty, not because Annabelle had escaped, because no one understood the warning. No living eye could see it. The officer who opened the trunk was named Harold Vance. He laughed when he found nothing inside. He told his partner the girl had gone insane. That night, Harold returned home to his wife and 2 sons. He ate dinner. He watched television. He went to bed. At 3:17 in the morning, his wife woke to the sound of whispering. Harold was standing in the corner of their bedroom, facing the wall. His wife asked what he was doing. He turned around. His eyes had been replaced with 2 blue glass doll eyes. He smiled until the skin at the corners of his mouth split. Then he walked into his son's room. Only 1 child survived, and he never spoke again. After that, Crooked Elm Lane was sealed for investigation, then abandoned, then forgotten by everyone who had the luxury of forgetting. The Bellamy house became a place teenagers dared one another to visit, and adults pretended not to notice. Windows were boarded. Grass swallowed the driveway. The porch sagged. Trees pressed close enough to scratch the siding in the wind. Sophie Bellamy grew up in institutions and foster homes, then changed her name. She never married. She never owned dolls, mirrors, rocking chairs, or anything with painted eyes. She kept lights on when she slept. Every year on Caleb's birthday, she received a card with no return address. Inside each card was a child's drawing of a house, a doll, a family, and one more person standing beside them than the year before. Years passed. The legend changed, as legends do. People said the Bellamy family had been murdered by the father. Others said Sophie had killed them. Some claimed a cult had used the house. Some said the doll was only a story invented by children. The name Annabelle became something whispered at sleepovers, said into mirrors, scratched into desks, typed beneath blurry photographs online. But the thing about names is that they are doors. Every time someone said it with fear, something listened. Every time someone wondered whether the doll was real, something smiled. Every time someone went looking, something waited. 21 years after the Bellamy deaths, a young couple bought the property at auction. Their names were Nathan and Claire Hensley. They had a baby daughter named June and a dog named Milo. Nathan restored old homes for a living and believed every dark story was a marketing opportunity. Claire ran a video channel about renovations, antiques, and forgotten houses. She had warm brown skin, bright eyes, and a laugh that filled empty rooms. She loved turning decay into beauty. She saw the Bellamy house and imagined polished floors, clean windows, sunlight in every room. Their first video at the property received more views than anything she had ever posted. She stood in front of the house with baby June on her hip, and Nathan beside her, holding the camera. "Welcome back, everyone," Claire said, smiling into the lens. Today, we are stepping inside what locals call the doll house of Crooked Elm Lane. There are a lot of stories about this place, most of them ridiculous, but we are going to restore it from top to bottom and find out what is really hiding inside. Behind her, in the upstairs left window, something pale moved. Viewers noticed later. Claire and Nathan did not. They entered with masks, gloves, and flashlights. The house smelled worse than expected. Mold climbed the walls. Animals had nested in the insulation. The living room floor had rotted where the old stain remained, though Nathan said it was probably water damage. In the upstairs hall, Claire found a child's drawing stuck behind a radiator. The paper was brittle. It showed 4 people lying down and a doll standing over them. "Creepy," she said, holding it up for the camera. The video comments exploded when the audio captured a small voice whispering, "5. The Hensleys laughed it off. The restoration lasted 9 days. On the second day, Milo refused to go upstairs. He stood at the bottom step, growling until foam gathered at his lips. That night, he vanished from the fenced yard. Nathan found him in the morning inside the locked storage room, though the door had been nailed shut. The dog was alive, but his fur had gone white around the muzzle. He crawled to Claire on his belly and whimpered whenever baby June laughed. On the 4th day, Nathan pried open a section of attic wall and found a small porcelain hand. He brought it downstairs, grinning. "Looks like we found a piece of the famous doll." Claire filmed it on the kitchen table. The hand was delicate, jointed, and stained dark at the wrist. As the camera focused, one finger curled. The video cut off there. Claire insisted it was a trick of perspective. Nathan said old porcelain shifted with temperature. They put the hand in a labeled evidence bag for future content. That night, baby June woke crying. Claire entered the nursery and found porcelain fingers sticking up from the crib mattress around her daughter, poking through the fabric like pale mushrooms. Tiny hands opened and closed, brushing the baby's blanket. June stared upward, smiling at something on the ceiling. Claire snatched her from the crib and screamed for Nathan. By the time he arrived, the mattress was smooth. No hands, no holes, only the faint smell of roses and dirty water. On the 6th day, the first contractor quit. He claimed he saw a little girl crawl backward down the hallway, her head dragging upside down between her shoulders. On the 7th day, that contractor fell from scaffolding at another job. Witnesses said he stepped backward from nothing while screaming, "Get it off me." He landed on a stack of rebar. One steel rod entered beneath his chin and came out through his left eye. Before he died, he laughed in a little girl's voice. On the 8th day, Claire stopped filming. On the 9th, Nathan found the rest of the doll. She was inside the wall behind the storage room, seated between studs, as if waiting in a narrow wooden throne. Her dress was yellowed but whole. Her bonnet was clean. One arm had been replaced. Around her neck hung a tag. Annabelle. Nathan stood very still. The camera in his hand recorded everything. Claire, watching from the doorway with June in her arms, whispered, "Put her back." But Nathan was not looking at Claire. He was looking at the doll's face. "She is smiling," he said. "She is a doll." "No," Nathan whispered. "She is smiling at me." The lights went out. When they came back on, Nathan was gone. Claire found him in the basement an hour later. He was standing beside the old well, holding Annabelle like a child. His face was wet with tears. "She said June is not ours," he said. Claire felt the world tilt. "Give me the doll." Nathan looked at the baby in her arms. "She said June was promised." The well breathed. Claire ran. She fled with June to the car, but the keys were missing. Her phone showed no signal. Milo barked from somewhere inside the house, then yelped, then went silent. Claire locked herself in the van with the baby until dawn. At first light, she saw Nathan standing on the porch. He was wearing the doll's bonnet. It had been tied beneath his chin so tightly that the string cut into his skin. His mouth was painted red in a small curved smile. His eyes were gone, replaced with buttons sewn into the sockets. In his arms, he held Milo's collar. Claire tried to drive without keys. She tried to break the window. She screamed until her voice failed. Nathan walked slowly down the steps, barefoot, leaving bloody footprints on the porch. Behind him, in the open doorway, Annabelle sat on the floor, watching. Claire did the only thing left. She climbed into the back of the van, wrapped June in a blanket, and kicked out the rear window with both feet. Glass tore her legs. She crawled through, clutching the baby, and ran into the woods. Branches whipped her face. Mud sucked at her shoes. June cried against her chest. Behind them, Nathan called her name in a voice that was not his. "Claire, come home." She ran until the trees thinned and the county road appeared. A truck stopped. The driver was an old woman with a cigarette trembling between her lips. She took one look at Claire and the baby, then at the woods behind them, and unlocked the passenger door. "Get in." Claire climbed inside. As they drove away, she looked back. Nathan stood at the edge of the trees. Annabelle stood beside him, holding his hand. The official story said Nathan Hensley suffered a psychotic episode and murdered himself after attacking his family. Claire refused interviews. Her channel vanished. The house burned 3 nights later under circumstances no investigator could explain. Firefighters said the flames were unusually cold. One man who entered the 2nd floor came out with frost on his eyebrows and burns shaped like small hands around his throat. In the ashes, they found no doll. Of course, they did not. Years later, a package arrived at a charity shop 2 towns over. No return address. No postage record anyone could trace. Inside was a porcelain doll in a cream dress and white bonnet. The volunteer who opened it was a college student named Mara. She thought the doll was ugly in an interesting way. Vintage, valuable to the right buyer. She set it in the front window on a little wooden chair. That evening, as she locked up, Mara noticed the doll's tag. "Annabelle." She smiled nervously and said aloud, "Well, aren't you creepy?" The shop lights flickered. Behind her, from the dark back room, a child giggled. Mara turned. Nothing. When she looked back at the window, the doll's head had shifted. Just a little, just enough to face her. And this is where I will leave you tonight, with one thought to carry into the dark. Not every haunting begins with a scream. Sometimes it begins with curiosity. Sometimes it begins when someone says a name they do not understand. Sometimes it begins when a doll is placed in a window, waiting for a new family to walk by, waiting for a child to point, waiting for a mother to say, "That one looks sweet." Because Annabelle does not chase. She does not need to. She waits. She learns the shape of your grief. She listens for the names of the dead you miss the most. She finds the room in your heart that you keep locked, and she knocks from the other side until you open it. So tonight, when the video ends, do not look too long at the dark reflection of your screen. Do not stare at the chair in the corner. Do not listen if you hear something small moving in another room. And if, by some chance, you wake in the quiet hour before dawn and find a doll sitting where no doll should be, smiling politely with folded hands and patient eyes, do not speak to it. Do not touch it. Do not ask what it wants, because by then it already knows. And somewhere, in the dark behind its painted smile, it is already smiling wider. Please subscribe, comment, and like the video for more. Good night.
Whispers of a love so true, painting dreams of me and you. And I'll hold you close in this moment so